Hello, and welcome back to Mammalian Knowledge. Today what we're going to be doing is we're going to continue our chapter on the nervous system. So chapter 12, Fundamentals of the Nervous System and Nervous Tissue. Currently we're in part 2, where we're talking about nervous tissue, and specifically we're going to be talking about the neuron in this video. The neuron is going to be the basic fundamental cell of the nervous system, and it's going to be important because it is specialized to be able to carry electrical current along its surface. And this will allow that electrical current to travel long distances through our body. So the nervous system plays a really important role in communication between organ to organ. Physiology, we call this electrical current or electrical impulse an action potential. We will also be able to call this current a nerve impulse. But throughout this lecture, I will be using the specific term action potential. The neuron has some really interesting characteristics when we compare it to other cells of the body. First and foremost, it has an extremely long lifespan when compared to other cells. A neuron can actually function for about 100 years, so it can function for the entire lifespan of an individual. So 100 years is just amazing, especially when you compare it to cells like the red blood cell, which only has a lifespan of 120 days or 700 miles throughout the circulatory system. For the most part, neurons also lack the ability to divide. Fetal neurons will divide as the fetus is developing, but once those neurons mature, they lose their ability to divide. So the neurons that we're born with, we're stuck with, and we'll have to repair them if we want to be able to use them if they get damaged. However, there are always exceptions in anatomy. There are a few places in the body where there are neural stem cells that can generate new neurons, and these are going to be located deep within the central nervous system, but these are only going to be in a few places. Neurons also have a very high metabolic rate. Because they are constantly signaling and sending information from one side of the body to another, they need a lot of energy to do that. And so therefore, they need a lot of nutrients and oxygen to be able to generate that energy. If a neuron is unable to generate the energy it needs, it is likely that the neuron will get damaged, and as a result, it could possibly die. So we need to get those nutrients and oxygen to these neurons. In this PowerPoint, we're going to look at two things about the neurons. First, we're going to look at a general structure for the typical neuron. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at the functional and anatomical classifications of neurons to see how we can divide them up based on what they look like and what they do. So let's talk about structure first. So we're going to mainly focus on a diagram rather than looking at the slides that I posted on Moodle. If you want to, I did write out definitions and a slide for each of these structures, so you can have a reference to look back on. But for this PowerPoint, I'm mainly going to just look at the diagram and explain it directly on the diagram. So let's first orient ourselves to this diagram. What we can see here is we can see a diagram of a neuron, and this diagram is kind of see in our body. Later on, we're going to be able to see the different shapes neurons can take and how we classify them based on its anatomical structure. In this diagram, we are also going to be able to see a neuron that, as it will look like under a light microscope. This looks very similar to the nervous tissue that you saw when we were studying histology and looking at nerves, nervous tissue in chapter 3. But I'm mainly going to focus on the diagram. The first structure I would like to talk about is dendrites. The etymology of dendrite comes from the word branch. So as you can see, dendrites are highly branched structures, and one of their major functions is to receive information from the environment using sensory receptors, or it's going to receive information from other neurons when two neurons synapse together. These dendrites are going to carry that information it collects to the cell body, located right here. The cell body can also be called the soma. Both words are okay, and I would accept both on the exam, so cell body or soma. So within the cell body, we can see structures such as the nucleus. Each nerve is only going to have one nucleus, and it's also going to have organelles that are important for protein synthesis. Some things that the cell body synthesizes is neurotransmitters. These are chemical messengers that are going to allow two neurons to communicate with each other. Examples of neurotransmitters are going to be serotonin, dopamine, GABA, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. We'll learn about these in a little bit more detail in future lectures. I want you to know that not only do dendrites collect information from other cells and the environment, but it is also the cell body can do that too. So both dendrites and the cell body can receive information from sensory receptors and other neurons. A really important structure of a neuron is going to be the axon. The axon is what's going to be responsible for generating and propagating the action that we talked about before, and it's going to carry it long distances. So the length of an axon will vary to be about 3 to 4 feet, or it can be very, very short. So an example of a really, really long axon would be the axons that go through the sciatic nerve on the back of our leg. It'll start at the base of our sacrum, and they can travel all the way to the tip of our toes. So it's going to be a very, very long axon, carrying information that quite a bit of a distance. Or they can be relatively short. Axons can also vary in diameter. I mentioned that because diameter is important for how fast an action potential can travel down the axon. The larger the diameter, the faster the electrical impulse or the action potential can travel, because it will have less resistance going through that axon. There are some features to be familiar with. Over here, what we can see is a cone-shaped structure. This cone-shaped structure is called the axon hillock, and the axon hillock will be attached to the cell body. This is what actually generates the action potential. It'll generate the electrical impulse, and that action potential will then propagate or move down the rest of the axon. Note something that is not illustrated here is axon collaterals. Some axons can actually branch, and they will actually branch almost in a 90-degree structure. And those collaterals will allow an axon to be able to synapse with multiple neurons or be able to synapse with multiple effector organs. So it can be used to create more complex neural circuitry. But not all neurons or axons are going to have that. At the end of the axons, we're going to have these things called terminal arborizations. Note that the word arbor is in this word. Arbor means tree. So again, it's going to refer to this branching structure that we see. All axons are going to have these terminal arborations, so all neurons will be branched at the end. There also will be these small little structures. These will be a little bit more bulbous at the end. We call these terminal boutons or buttons. Another name for these areas are axon terminals. I prefer to use myself. And these axon terminals will be important in synapsing with dendrites or cell bodies on another neuron that this neuron would be communicating with. So just to review quickly, we have the dendrites located here, which would receive signals. We have the cell body here, which would receive signals as well and contain the organelles. We have the axon that would propagate the action potential, with the axon helix generating that action potential. Collaterals would be located here, branching off of the original axon and allowing for more complex neural circuitry. Over here, we would have the terminal arborations and the terminal boutons, or the axon terminals, and they would allow for communication with other neurons. So that is the typical structure of a neuron. Let's now look at the anatomical and functional classifications of neurons. So there are three major shapes or anatomical classes of neurons: unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar neurons. The type of neuron that we talked about when we were looking at the general shape of a neuron is a multipolar neuron. And most neurons, about 99% neurons in our body, are going to be multipolar. So they're called multipolar because they're going to have many branches coming off of the cell body. So over here, we're going to have many dendrites located here. And we're going to have a single axon branching off. Note that in the central nervous system, sometimes there are multipolar neurons that will lack an axon completely. It's just a weird fluke that they have to them. So multipolar is going to be located with here with many dendrites and a long axon that sometimes is optional. Bipolar neurons, on the other hand, are going to have two processes that are going to extend from the cell body. So on this diagram, there is a cell body located here. And over here, what we're going to have is we're going to have many dendrites that are going to fuse together to form one dendritic process. And on the other end of the cell body, we're going to have the axon with the axon terminals at the end. So we call these bipolar because bi stands for two. And so this is going to have two sides or two branches off the cell body. Bipolar neurons are very, very rare, but some of them can be found in sensory organs, such as the retina of the eyes. Unipolar, uni meaning one, is going to have a single branch coming off of the cell body. So here on this diagram, we have the cell body located here, and we have a single branch coming off. This branch will actually bifurcate. It will split into two branches. And essentially, this will act as kind of one long axon. We'll have small dendrites at the end, at the initial kind of part, and then the rest of it will be a long axon that will travel along the length of the cell. These are found a lot in the sensory neurons. Sensory neurons are like pseudo-unipolar cells, so that would be kind of an example of that. So those are the three anatomical classes of neurons: multipolar, bipolar, unipolar. There are some really nice diagrams in your textbook that goes over these individually, so I would check it out. I'll give you a moment to be able to pause on this diagram if you want to read through it thoroughly. And then there is another part to this diagram as well that shows where it would be in the body, and also some variations that could exist on these structures. In addition to having anatomical classes, we're also going to have functional classes of neurons. And these three functional classes would be sensory, motor, and interneurons. And what I've done here is I've included a figure that would show these three structures kind of interacting with each other. So just so you guys know, for this diagram that we're looking at, this is actually a cross-section of the spinal cord, and over here is a spinal nerve, and we're seeing different types of neurons coming in and out of the spinal cord. The first type is going to be sensory neurons. This makes up the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system. And really what it's going to do is it's going to carry information from sensory receptors into the central nervous system. So over here, what we can see is we can see the sensory nerve coming in. The cell body will be located here, and it will actually enter the central nervous system right over here. So we can see it entering the spinal cord. These nerves are going to be pseudo-unipolar neurons, and so they're going to have almost a unipolar shape to them. The next type of neuron that I want to talk about is motor neurons. Motor neurons are going to be part of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system, and they're going to carry information from the central nervous system, so from like the brain and spinal cord, out to the effector organs. So the effector organs would be things such as muscles, glands, and adipose tissue in the body. The typical shape for motor neurons is going to be a multipolar neuron, and the cell body of this neuron is going to be primarily found in the central nervous system, but it can also be found in areas of the autonomic nervous system. My apologies, this is spelled incorrectly. Autonomic. There we go. Much better. Last type of neuron that we can classify based on its function is an interneuron. Interneurons are going to be completely located within the central nervous system, and one of their major jobs is to connect sensory and motor neurons. They're going to be really important because they play an essential role in neural circuits, and so it can lead to complex neural responses. So we'll talk about that more when we get into neural circuitry. but interneurons are mainly going to be located in between sensory and motor neurons. So that is going to be our lecture about the neurons. Be sure that you're comfortable with the overall function of the neuron. Be able to identify the different structures on the neuron and be able to classify neurons based on its anatomical structure and its functions. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.